Who is reading the tea leaves for us with this Mueller investigation. All right, so George Papadopoulos lies to the FBI, and we can assume that at the time James Comey's FBI knew the answers, asked him the questions, knew he lied, right? I mean, the FBI, as they do in the movies, they never ask a question they don't know the answer to.
I think it's reasonable to assume that the FBI, through counterintelligence means, knew much more about the, quote, London professor and, quote, Vladimir Putin's niece than they let on to Papadopoulos when they interviewed him.
Right.
Yes.
And so he lied and said, the big lie, I guess, was that he said, what are you talking about? I talked to those guys long before I was ever on the Trump campaign, which was factually incorrect.
It was false, and then he made some other false statements in terms of the timing, and then in particular the substance of his conversations with the niece and the professor.
What do you make of the coincidence, Greg Willard, that George Papadopoulos lies to James Comey's FBI, and later that day, James Comey is invited to the White House and has dinner with Donald Trump, where Donald Trump asks for his loyalty?
I think that is purely a coincidence. It would be one thing. It's one thing, McGraw, if the dots are a few hours apart. It would be another thing if it was a few weeks, perhaps. But I think that was a parallel event that is now connected in retrospect. But at the time, I think it's a stretch to say that those two events were connected.
What do we think of the fact that it was released yesterday? People are saying it's moving fast, it's moving methodical. What are your thoughts as you watched yesterday?
Oh, I think methodical is a good word. We could go back for a moment, McGraw. Robert Mueller is a special counsel. You and I talked on the air several months ago when he was appointed, and I said, I reminded our listeners that the last special counsel, in fact, the only other special counsel under this regulation, was our mutual good friend Jack Danforth.
Right.
Well, I think Jack Danforth's investigation of the Waco incident with the Branch Davidians, I think methodical was a good and is a good characterization of Jack's work in Waco. I think the same thing so far can be said, not surprisingly, I might add, of Robert Mueller.
What do you make of the $10 million bail? What do you make of the House arrest? Those are some pretty interesting side stories to this.
Well, the $10 million bail and the House arrest, I think, are not surprising, because if you read the allegations in the indictment and the lavishness and the amount of money and his international relationships, I think from a law school textbook, McGraw, that's a prima facie case of a flight risk. I think the judge yesterday took that into account. I understand she took a break and went back into chambers to deliberate her decision. So the fact that it's a $10 million bail in a $75 million alleged money laundering scheme of someone who travels the world, that led then to a $10 million bail and house arrest is not surprising at all.
What happens now? What happens to Manafort and Gates?
I think there's two paths. One is the federal rules of criminal procedure, and that prosecution will proceed. And there will be discovery and an exchange of Brady material and all as they prepare their defense and then eventually go to trial. So that's sort of back to the law school textbook, McGraw. The second is, I think it is highly likely that there will be approaches made to both Manafort and Gates to see if their cooperation can be elicited in terms of what other crimes may have been committed and other information that Mueller and the FBI investigators are seeking. But that may go on, it may not go on, but what will go on is the prosecution of Manafort and Gates.
So, knowing my law from Law and Order, Mr. McCoy would put the two guys in a room and say, whoever talks first gets the best deal. Gates, Manafort, you're on the clock. Manafort wants to talk. We're coming to you first. Is this how they do it?
Well, there are lots of techniques. Manafort in particular is represented by very experienced counsel. And so as to what the FBI and Mr. Mueller and his colleagues decide will be the best way to try to precipitate those discussions, who knows? It might be the law and order model. It may be something else. It may be, for example, McGraw, that there are no approaches for a period of time while they go out and flip others and get plea agreements as they move up the chain, again, as happened in Watergate.
What do you make of, and this isn't getting any attention, and I don't know why, but what do you make of Tony Podesta, the brother of John Podesta, whose emails were stolen, who was running the Hillary campaign, resigns from his high-powered lobbying firm yesterday? What do you make of that?
I make of that, to quote the line in the movie Betty Davis and All About Eve, fasten your seatbelt, it's going to be a bumpy ride for Mr. Podesta.
You think he's involved with this somewhere?
Well, again, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to begin to connect some dots. Last summer, they filed retroactively, they being the Podesta Group, a registration for work they were doing with the Ukrainian groups.
Right.
So the idea that the Podesta Group was involved with the Ukrainians and may have, shall we say, tripped up in terms of how they comported their activities, we shall see. But the fact that someone as prominent in Democratic circles,
yes,
and foreign representations and all, as the Podesta Group and Tony Podesta would resign, fasten your seatbelt. I'm afraid it's going to be a bumpy ride for them.
So this also sort of brings in Democratic people. I mean, there could be some stink on some Democratic groups in this.
Oh, this could be a very bipartisan mess. And as the president has been clamoring as recently as his tweets yesterday, in terms of the Russians and the uranium deal and all. So yes, indeed, it could be a bipartisan mess. And again, to go back to our earlier discussion about Mueller's original appointment, remember we talked about on the air, McGraw, that there's a phrase in his appointment that he can investigate, and it includes such other matters as may arise in the course of his investigation.
Right.
So he's not limited to these claims of Russian collusion with the Trump campaign. His investigation may take him into areas that may involve, ironic as it may be, the Democrats.
Right. All right, Greg Willard, professor at St. Louis University Law School. Keep your phone on. It's on speed dial here at the Big 550 KTRS. Thank you, sir.
Great to be with you, my friend.
9:35, Big 550.